At a complex of research institutes near Prague, Stan was involved in laboratory testing of LSD and other substances such as psilocybin and mescaline. 40 test subjects, a mix of healthy individuals and psychiatric patients, would undergo hourly blood draws, urine samples, and psychological and neurological testing during their sessions, all in the hope of identifying the chemical source of mental illness.
Well, the initial excitement was that LSD can produce what we called experimental psychosis. We can give it to quote-unquote normal people, we can do all kinds of tests before, during, and after, and we get an idea what's happening biochemically when the psyche is so profoundly influenced. And this was fascinating because we are talking about microscopic amounts. 100 millions of a gram can change profoundly human consciousness for 6 to 8 hours. If this is the case, mental diseases, it would be aberrations of chemistry. Now, if we could identify this chemical culprit, we could also find some kind of neutralizing agent. And this would have been like test tube solution of schizophrenia and other psychosis. This would be like holy grail of psychiatry.
But during the testing, it became clear that it was impossible to predict the kind of experience subjects would have, regardless of what psychedelic they took. In fact, the same subject could have dramatically different experiences while taking the same substance on different occasions.
So this is not the way pharmacology works. You have a pretty good idea what response you would get with antibiotics or whatever substance we are talking about. We are dealing with a catalyst, and that the content is not produced by the substances, but that it's released from the deep unconscious realms that current psychiatry and psychology does not know about. Because when it comes, they think it's pathological. They don't see it as something that's germane to the human psyche. And then I started seeing it as a telescope or a microscope. With the telescope, we can see galaxies that we cannot normally study. With microscope, you discover an enormous micro-world that is here, but we are not aware of it unless we have the proper tool. And so then I took it from the laboratory to clinical practice and started seeing it as something that's going to deepen and intensify psychotherapy.
During this period, Stan won a competition with a paper he wrote about his realizations. The prize earned him the directorship of the psychedelic program at a newly built research center. Just as in the laboratory testing, subjects in the clinical tests had a broad range of experiences, including blissful and ecstatic ones. And even emotionally challenging experiences were soothed as the session ended and memories that had surfaced were resolved. Stan even noted that the clinical session seemed very similar to classic psychotherapy, but over time, patterns emerged.
The contents in the unconscious were not stored in the form of kind of disconnected mosaic, but they were forming certain dynamic constellations. Certain issues were appearing on different levels at different times of their biography, and they were creating these dynamic packets that were connected with the same type of emotions or a physical feeling. Let's say they would have a choking constellation. They would be near drowning when they were 7, then being choked by an older brother repeatedly when they were 4, then whooping cough. But then the deeper level was the choking at birth. So I started talking about these constellations as COEX systems.
In addition to the understanding of COEX systems, Stan observed how the experiences of his clients evolved dramatically during a series of sessions.
Only the early sessions seemed to have the nature of the experiences that I knew from psychoanalysis. But then sooner or later, even if we are using sort of just medium dosages, people started talking about being in a place where they felt their life was threatened, that they're going crazy, they will never get out of that state. They started having experiences of choking or nausea, and then one after another told me that they believe that what they are experiencing must be a reliving of birth. At a certain point, I decided to test this, and I took 300 micrograms on my own at home. Within an hour, I was in a very, very difficult place. On the wall, I had paintings which I painted, and there was one which was like a stylized dog with a soldier. They started fighting, and then I had the feeling that everything was kind of closing in. And very quickly, I was in something that I now call the second perinatal matrix. It was like a space where it seemed absolutely hopeless, very, very uncomfortable emotionally. And then I started feeling a pressure on my head. I realized that I was somehow stuck in the birth canal, and all my life appeared to be absolutely meaningless. I started seeing the deep truth in existential philosophy. Life is absurd. We go from nowhere to nowhere. We start life as infants in pain, and this is how we are going to end. That even if I knew that this was birth, then somehow the thought came that this state would not end unless I find meaning in life. And then I said, well, it's knowledge. And I saw myself going to libraries, devouring one book after another. And then it took me to the end of my life when I couldn't remember what I had for dinner, let alone what I read in all those books. And then I said, well, having children gives meaning to your life. And then it was like, well, you don't give meaning to your life by creating creatures whose life is as meaningless as yours. And then after some time, it just sort of very rapidly opened up, and suddenly I was in a very ecstatic state. And I realized you cannot find meaning in life using your reason. This was a very important first experience that suddenly showed me whole new potentials of psychedelics.
Through his own experiences and those of his patients, Stan learned that lower doses brought up biographical information, while higher ones brought patients much farther. He also noted that something fascinating was happening.
When I was hitting some difficult places, I had a parade of my patients, and I suddenly understood where they were, including the meaninglessness and even suicidal impulses. Equipped with current psychiatry, I just had no clue. The only way was experiential learning. You cannot learn that from books what these patients are going through.
Without the distraction of constant testing and with higher doses of LSD, Stan's clients were encouraged to go inward. To Stan's surprise, they kept journeying back to the perinatal realm.
It's not easy to really question some of the really fundamental assumptions. And I had a very personal experience that made it even worse. I went as a second-year student to a lecture of Professor William Laufberger, and I asked, how far back does our memory go? Can we, for example, relive our birth? And he looked at me like I was a total asshole, and I say, of course not. I mean, the cortex is not myelinized. And then everybody was laughing, so I was pretty ashamed. So I had that kind of an additional memory, like this was really stupid to think that you could relive your birth, even if it seems very convincing. But then, of course, if I saw it again and again, and I had a few more experiences myself, I realized that this edifice of psychiatry, that looks so respectable, it's like a colossus on clay feet.
As Stan described the scientific establishment's reluctance to accept perinatal memories, I remembered my 30 hours of labor giving birth to my daughter Charlotte. I eventually needed help pushing her out. Maybe that's why she wouldn't go through those tunnels at the playgroup. I was so concerned that I took her to see an osteopath. The doctor swore that she wasn't applying any pressure to Charlotte's head. Afterwards, Charlotte had no problem going through the tunnels. When Charlotte was 20 months old, we were attacked by 2 gunmen. We were living in the suburbs outside of Paris, and I was 4 months pregnant with my son, Oscar. The first shot missed my head by about 12 inches, and the remaining 3 shattered our bedroom windows. We escaped unharmed, but for a month or so, I'd wake up at night, reliving the experience and imagining where I would hide. Later, when Oscar was old enough to play hide and seek, no one could find him. Oscar! Oscar? It was clear to me now that my children's behavior had been influenced either by what had happened while they were in the womb or during their actual birth. How could scientists so easily dismiss the reality of perinatal memories?
The usual view about the mind is that the mind's confined to the head. It's nothing but the activity of the brain. For the materialists, who represent the majority position within academic life and in science, minds are what brains do, and memories are stored materially inside the brain. It's all inside the brain. I think that's an incredibly truncated and narrow view. First of all, I think we access our memories by morphic resonance. They're not inside the brain. And secondly, I think that our consciousness, our minds, are not confined to the inside of our heads, but stretch out beyond them through fields. We're all used to the idea of magnetic fields being inside magnets and stretching beyond them, or the gravitational field of the Earth being inside the Earth and stretching out into space invisibly, or the fields of cell phones being inside the cell phone and stretching invisibly around it, which is why they work. All matter now has fields associated with it. And of course the brain does. It has electromagnetic fields you can measure with an electroencephalograph. But I think that the fields of the mind are much more extensive. And these extended fields of the mind are a kind of morphic field. So it's really a field theory of the mind.
Now that I realized that we could hold memories from our time in the womb, I couldn't stop thinking about the influence these unconscious memories might have on our lives. One of Stan's clients showed just how powerful these memories are.
The patient whom I call Peter came with a kind of a combination of obsession and masochistic impulses and tremendous need and wish to be locked in a cellar and be exposed to some emotional and physical pains, tortures.
Peter would search for these men in parks, train stations, and other public places. And on one occasion, he was struck on the head and robbed. The last episode occurred when Peter was on a train with a man who claimed to have the perfect cellar to satisfy his obsession. When the man got up to use the toilet, Peter gave in to his gnawing doubt and opened the man's bag. Horrified by what he found, Peter jumped from the moving train and ended up in the hospital. When psychiatric treatment failed to help him, he was sent to Stan, where he underwent a series of high-dose LSD sessions.
There's a very, very interesting COEX system emerged in a series of sessions. The most superficial layers were actually the traumas that he himself created. Then as we continued, another layer of the COEX system emerged, which was from the Second World War, when he was taken to Nazi Germany and used in a situation where there was a great danger of bombardment. Two of the SS officers were using him for their homosexual practices, initially under gunpoint. And then it went to his childhood, when his father was alcoholic, was very, very brutal, and used to beat him with a leather strap. And his mother, who actually always wore black, punished him repeatedly by locking him in a dark cellar and leaving him without food. So on that level, it seemed like it was a combined punishment from the two parents that he was seeking. Finally, it ended up in a situation where he was stuck in the birth canal and realized that was the template of the situation that he was searching for. But when he actually experienced that, he got more than he bargained for.
Because Stan had previously experienced the kind of death-rebirth process Peter underwent, he was not fearful for Peter's safety and could allow the full process to unfold. After that session, Peter was finally liberated from his self-destructive impulses and able to live a productive life. Around the time Stan was working with Peter, he traveled to Amsterdam for a conference on LSD psychotherapy.
Pauline McCrick and Joyce Martin were two psychoanalysts who were actually using LSD and doing what they called fusion therapy. Clients who were deprived in their childhood of being held would lie with full body contact, and they had amazing results with this. We were both in Amsterdam, and so we decided to have a session. As part of my last perinatal session, I went into this atmosphere of bloody revolutions, and in the middle of it, I really identified with Lenin. I shared his passion against oppression, and I realized that part of it was the Tsar, but a good part of it was the compression of the birth canal, so this kind of atmosphere of revolutions and struggling for birth, somehow completely fused. And I realized that there's a relationship between historical events like wars and revolutions and what we carry in the perinatal level, possibly even something that is a source of that kind of violence. But then the session ended, and I went through the whole range of relationships with women, the destructive feminine that comes in birth, the adventure, the exciting, like a sexual partner. And then I had a feeling of being an infant on her body. The transition from the third matrix into the fourth was like emerging sort of in fire. There was like a goddess with dark complexion and the peak of paradise or heaven. So it was a very, very blissful experience, where she became like a great mother for me.
Stan's session with Pauline in Amsterdam revealed the archetypal nature of the birth experience, during which the fetus is exposed to a collective dimension filled with powerful imagery and emotion. But a newborn lacks the capacity to make sense of what is witnessed, and so these impressions remain in the unconscious, influencing us in ways that we don't realize.
One of the great contributions of Stan's work is that he uncovered the deep structure, the archetypal pattern, you might say, of the life process as it is incarnated and reincarnated in us as individuals.
When Stan discovered the work of Lloyd Demas and the field of psychohistory, he noted the parallels between the imagery used to goad people to war and experiences that he and his patients had during their sessions. It became clear to Stan that these unconscious memories of helplessness from the second matrix and anger from the third were driving factors in the need for power. This need for control was clearly evident in the book A Sexual Profile of Men in Power, which detailed a 7-year study of call girls and madams whose primary clients were politicians and government officials. The study found that over 50% of those men regularly hired prostitutes, and more than half of them demanded kinky or sadomasochistic sex as a means of coping with the powerlessness that they experienced in government.
9 months in a total dependence on the maternal organism, then there is this incredible roller coaster of birth that we are taking through, and then emerging the total dependence on the mother. It leaves a very deep fear of the feminine in the male psyche, and frequently clumsy effort to compensate for it, not giving women the same rights, not to treat them as equal citizens, and so on. Women go through that also, but because of their physiological function, because of their anatomy, they are able to participate directly in the process of creation. The male participation is very marginal. It can take, a few minutes, and then it's over. The way to resolve traumatic unconscious memory would be if that material fully emerges into consciousness, which would be therapeutic. What can happen in everyday life, it comes close to the surface, but that person does not realize what it is exactly, but they feel the need to create a situation that would involve those elements. So, for example, the transition from the third to the fourth matrix frequently is experienced as fire. I worked with some people who were arsonists, and they had this impulse. They felt that something fantastic would happen if they could experience a big fire. When that happens, they watched it and they feel excitement for a while, but that there's a real letdown. They expected something much more phenomenal, but the drive can be strong enough to drive them to do it again and again. In a very similar way, the third matrix involves a lot of sadomasochistic kind of experiences where you feel sexual arousal and you feel confined and you feel sort of choked and so on. It's a kind of unrecognized healing impulse. But for it to be therapeutic, it would have to involve introspection, understanding what you are dealing with, and really be fully, consciously in touch with that material. Yeah.
Nothing the conscious mind can think up will ever satisfy the unconscious. It has to originate from the unconscious to be cleared.